He didn't see a woman, he saw a target. That's what Leona Carter said, barely conscious, with tubes down her throat and stitches across her chest. She wasn't running. She wasn't armed. She was reaching for her ID. And still the officer shot her 3 times without warning. But what he didn't know was that Leona wasn't just another black woman he could silence. She was a federal legal analyst with top-level clearance, and her brother a Marine with orders to expose everything. This wasn't a mistake. It was a system working exactly as it was designed until it picked the wrong person to destroy. You're watching the story of what happens when truth fights back. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it where you are? Let us know below. It was just past 10:15 on a Tuesday night when Leona Carter pulled into the dimly lit gas station on the edge of her childhood neighborhood, the kind of place where shadows stretched long and quiet, and the only sounds were the hum of the overhead lights and the soft click of a pump shutting off in the distance. She had driven 13 miles across town from her father's modest brick house, where the medicine cabinet had sat empty and her father's breath had grown shallow from a missing bottle of heart medication. She hadn't planned on coming back to this town for more than a few days, just enough time to help him settle after a rough winter and stock the fridge with something other than microwavable dinners. But sometimes the smallest errands unfold into something far larger than anyone expects. As she stepped out of her black SUV, the cool night air wrapped around her like a warning she couldn't quite name, and the yellowish lights overhead flickered slightly, as if unsure of their duty to illuminate what was about to happen. Her shoes clicked softly against the cracked asphalt, her coat still damp from the evening drizzle, and in her right hand she carried a small black leather purse that had once belonged to her mother. There was no music playing, no people milling about, just a stillness that felt too deliberate to ignore, like the kind of silence that made you hesitate before stepping forward. But Leona wasn't new to discomfort. She had cross-examined governors and sued police departments twice this size. Yet something in her chest still tightened when she noticed the patrol car idling by the edge of the lot, headlights off, engine humming low. Inside that vehicle, Officer Travis Kincaid sat slouched, watching through half-lowered eyelids as she approached the storefront. He'd been on shift since 4 p.m., dragging through the final hours with coffee-stained fingers, and the self-importance of a man who'd never had to question his place in the world. When he saw her, he sat up straighter. Not because she looked threatening. Leona was dressed plainly in dark jeans and a navy sweater, but because something about her confidence, the upright posture, the way she didn't glance toward him at all, rubbed against a long-held suspicion he'd come to call instinct. He opened his door with the kind of exaggerated casualness that made his intent even more obvious, and his boots thudded on the pavement as he made his way toward her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, hand resting on his duty belt fingers, brushing the edge of his holster like a pianist warming up a scale. Leona paused halfway between her car and the store entrance, her breath visible in the cool night. She turned slowly, calmly, like someone used to being approached by men with guns and questions. "Yes, officer," she said, her voice even but not cold. Kincaid narrowed his eyes and angled the beam of his flashlight directly into hers, flooding her vision with white. "What are you doing out here this late?" he asked, stepping closer, his tone skating that thin edge between official concern and personal challenge. She lifted a hand to shield her face and responded, "My father's out of his heart meds. The pharmacist's expecting me, just picking up a refill." Her voice carried no apology, just fact, and that in itself seemed to irritate him. "Gonna need to see some ID," he said, shifting his weight forward, stance squared, chest puffed. "We've had a couple break-ins around here." Leona inhaled, slowly steadying herself, then nodded. "Of course," she said, her left hand slipping into her coat pocket for the wallet tucked safely inside. "I'll get it for you." Her movements were measured, deliberate. She'd argued enough use of force cases in court to know exactly what not to do. Still, in the officer's eyes, something flared, something wired deep and ugly and old. Later, he would claim she made a sudden move, that her hand twitched toward her waistband, that the shadows played tricks, that training kicked in. But there were no shadows near her. Only the harsh, sterile glow of the gas station lights and the unmistakable click of a purse's zipper sliding open. And then, before she could even say, "Here," he drew and fired. One shot, then two, then a third, each one echoing like punctuation in the stillness, slicing through the night, and her chest with a finality no apology could undo. Leona crumpled to the ground, her purse falling beside her, its contents spilling like a slow confession, a driver's license, a legal bar card, a Marine Corps challenge coin, engraved with her brother's rank. Her body writhed once before, settling, eyes wide but dimming. The sound of her breath trying to return filled the lot, and from inside her coat pocket, her personal phone, a special device provided to federal personnel, began to ring. Officer Kincaid stood over her gun, still drawn, lips parting as he saw the flash of a secure government logo on the phone screen. A name he didn't recognize, a title he didn't understand. He looked down at her again, at her dark skin, her neat hair, her badge that didn't belong to any police department, but outranked every badge he had ever worn. "What the hell?" he whispered as the first sirens wailed in the distance and backup drew closer. Inside the store, the night clerk crouched behind the counter, too afraid to move. Across the street, an elderly woman named Rosa Peña had dropped her shopping bag and was now standing completely still, one hand over her mouth. She had seen it all. The way Leona had turned, the calm in her voice, the deliberate motion of her hand, and the way the officer had pulled the trigger without a word more. The way he hadn't even given her a chance to explain. And so began a story not about a misunderstanding or a tense moment of uncertainty, but about power and silence, and a woman who would live barely to remember exactly how it happened. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is not a weapon. It's a black woman who refuses to shrink under suspicion, and a man with a badge who can't stand the sight of that. Leona's blood pooled quietly under her dark against the faded white lines of the parking lot. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., a military phone buzzed once on a mahogany desk, waking a man who was about to change everything. The parking lot was swarming with flashing red and blue by the time Chief Dennis Holt arrived, his sedan screeching to a halt beside the cordoned-off perimeter as two young officers moved aside without a word. The air still carried the sharp scent of burnt gunpowder, but the crowd hadn't yet gathered, just the echo of sirens fading into the quiet and the low murmur of radios crackling back and forth like nervous whispers. Officer Travis Kincaid stood a few feet from the body, his face pale, but his jaw-tight eyes darting everywhere except toward the woman bleeding out near the curb. One hand rested on his holster, even though the danger, real or imagined, was long gone. His other hand gripped the edge of the patrol cruiser, as if anchoring himself in a storm of his own making. Chief Holt approached slowly, not in urgency to assess the victim, but with the deliberate pace of a man calculating outcomes. He had led the department for over a decade, long enough to know which messes could be quietly cleaned and which might leave permanent stains. "What happened?" he asked, low and direct eyes flicking to the purse spilled open on the pavement where a glint of military brass caught the fluorescent glare of the station lights. She reached Kincaid, said quickly, his voice firm like a man sticking to the version he'd practiced in the split seconds after pulling the trigger. "I told her to stop. She didn't. I thought she had a weapon." The sentence was smooth, polished, too clean for something that had just happened less than 15 minutes ago. The paramedics were already working on Leona, trying to stabilize her enough for transport, though one glance told Holt this wasn't just another incident that could be buried in paperwork. Her ID had already been bagged, and Holt motioned for the officer handling evidence to bring it over. He read the name once, then again, slower this time. Leona Carter, civil rights attorney. A crease formed between his brows, the kind that doesn't come from guilt but from recognizing a complication. What really made his stomach tighten wasn't her legal credentials, it was the second card tucked inside the clear pouch behind her license. The Department of Defense insignia gleamed under the plastic, and beneath it the seal of the United States Marine Corps, marked with the name Jeremiah Carter. Holt didn't say a word as he handed the badge back, but his mind was already running through contingencies. "Secure the scene," he barked to no one in particular, and then turned to his deputy. "Where's the footage?" The young sergeant hesitated. "We've got the body cams, sir, but Officer Kincaid's unit reported a sync error." Holt's face hardened. "Gas station cameras. Inside probably, but the manager's still in shock." Holt nodded once and headed straight for the storefront. Inside the small convenience store, the night manager was shaking eyes wide behind thick glasses, hands trembling as he pointed toward the back office. Holt followed, not bothering to introduce himself, not bothering to ask for permission. The monitor wall showed 5 different angles: entrance lot, interior aisles, back room, and one camera that covered just enough of the sidewalk to capture the encounter. "I'll need those tapes," Holt said flatly. The manager nodded and reached for the keyboard. "Transfer them here," Holt added, tapping the external drive already in his hand, one he had pulled from his coat pocket without ceremony. The clerk did as told, but his hands fumbled slightly, and when Holt leaned over to check the files later, he muttered, "Corrupted on transfer. We'll follow up." Back outside, the scene had changed subtly. The woman was gone en route to County General, and the street was waking up. Neighbors had stepped onto porches. A man walked his dog slower than necessary, watching the officers with narrowed eyes. And yet even here, even now, Holt could feel the machinery beginning to move. Not the public machinery, but the private kind, the institutional reflex that kicked in whenever one of their own might face heat. It started with tightening the story. She appeared agitated. Holt suggested eyes scanning the officers around him. Didn't respond to verbal commands, possibly under influence. The implication was quiet but enough. "Any witnesses?" he asked. Sergeant Lewis checked his pad. Clerk inside, an older woman across the street, and some guy who stopped his car by pump 4. Holt's eyes locked with his. "Interview all 3. Make sure they understand the seriousness of giving false statements against a law enforcement officer. No threats, just emphasis." That was Holt's style. He didn't shout or gesture. He didn't need to. In the hours that followed, the incident report was drafted with language so carefully curated it could have passed for press release copy. "Suspect refused orders," it read. "Officer feared for his safety after sudden movement consistent with reaching for a weapon." No mention of Leona's ID, no mention of her credentials. Certainly no mention of the phone that had continued to ring after she'd hit the ground. Later that night, the evidence technician logged the purse contents into a sealed bag, but somehow, Leona's secure government-issued phone didn't make it to the inventory. Must have fallen out, someone would say. Scene was chaotic. The excuse always worked because it always had. And inside the station, behind a door with a frosted glass plaque that read, "Chief Holt sat alone flipping through Leona's name on a government database." Her background was pristine. Harvard Law, civil rights litigation in Atlanta, federal consulting work. Her brother's name lit up in a different database. Marine Corps Counterterrorism Task Force current assignment classified. Holt exhaled slowly, then picked up the phone. "We need to get ahead of this," he said to the department's PR liaison. "There's a narrative forming, and it better be ours." Meanwhile, in the break room, Officer Kincaid sat silent, staring at the wall, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. A styrofoam cup of coffee sat untouched beside him, the steam long since vanished. Another officer passed by and clapped him on the shoulder. "You did what you had to do," the man said. "Don't let the noise get to you." Kincaid didn't respond, not because he disagreed, but because a part of him was starting to realize the noise had already begun, and it wasn't just outside, it was in his head. Outside, the gas station was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. The blood had been washed away by the fire hose, the caution tape taken down, the bystanders gone back inside. But the silence was different now. Not calm, not still, just waiting. Because the story hadn't ended here. It had only just begun. Jeremiah Carter was already awake when the encrypted ping came through a low pulse of vibration on the nightstand beside his cot, followed by a faint green glow that only those with Pentagon clearance would recognize. The digital screen showed a code sequence tied to his sister's emergency signal, a protocol they'd established 2 years earlier, but never once had to use. He sat up slowly, not because he was tired, but because some part of him already knew that whatever had triggered that signal wasn't an accident or a test. His fingers moved fast across the screen, unlocking layers of security, but the message was chilling in its simplicity. Leona, non-verbal. Hospitalized. GSW. For a long moment he didn't move, just stared at the message while the darkness of the room seemed to hold its breath with him. Then came the stillness that only soldiers understand, that strange suspension of panic when your mind slides into protocol and grief waits quietly outside the door while duty takes over. Jeremiah rose and dressed quickly, pulling on civilian clothes with military precision dark jeans, a utility jacket, boots still laced from the day before. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need to. As he moved through the narrow halls of his Arlington apartment, his thoughts formed not in words but in strategies, flight times, jurisdictional barriers, legal tools, back channels. He grabbed a leather folder from the locked drawer in his desk, one marked only with a silver seal, and slid his sidearm into the hidden compartment of his duffel bag. Not because he planned on using it, but because he knew the game they might be walking into. Outside, the city hadn't yet woken. The streets were slick from an early rain and the sky hung low, purple with oncoming dawn. He slid into the government-issued vehicle and drove in silence, the dashboard lights reflecting across his face as he reviewed what little information had come through. No details on the officer, no video, no statement from the department, just Leona's name on a trauma intake file and a line of code that meant her phone had gone dark the moment after the alert. At the airport, he bypassed commercial gates entirely, heading straight to the military access terminal where a quiet nod and the flash of credentials got him on the first eastbound transport. No one asked questions, not even the pilot. By the time the jet left the tarmac, Jeremiah had already dispatched 2 secure messages, one to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division and another to an internal task force dealing with extremist infiltration in law enforcement, both teams he had worked with, both now alerted under quiet flags that something serious had happened in a town no one had heard of until that night. He didn't feel fear, not exactly. What he felt was deeper, colder, a slow-burning certainty that whatever had happened to Leona wasn't random. She wasn't the type to provoke. She wasn't the type to disobey a command without cause. And even if she had, there were rules. There were procedures. She knew them. She had taught them. The fact that she had been shot at all already told him more than the report ever would. By the time he touched down near the town where they'd both grown up, the sun had begun to rise, casting a grayish light over fields that hadn't changed since the day he enlisted. He didn't stop to visit their father. He didn't call the hospital first. He drove straight to the town's police department, parked across the street, and watched in silence. The building looked quiet, but the kind of quiet that suggested doors being closed a little too tightly, and shades pulled down before the light got in. Jeremiah didn't walk in with his badge displayed. He didn't announce his rank. He entered as a brother, not as a Marine. But the moment he stepped through the glass doors and said his sister's name, the atmosphere shifted. The desk sergeant stiffened. A second officer behind the glass looked up and then quickly looked away. "There's no public information about any incident," the sergeant said, tone clipped, eyes guarded. "You'll need to contact our media relations office during business hours." "I'm here on behalf of the Department of Defense," Jeremiah replied evenly, setting a sealed envelope on the desk, his voice steady. "And I strongly recommend someone in leadership reads that before I make a formal inquiry through federal channels." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. But his presence filled the room like a rising tide, quiet but undeniable. The sergeant picked up the envelope slowly, thumb tracing the seal, then disappeared into the back. Jeremiah waited. 15 minutes passed. No one returned, no update, no call back. Just silence, like the building itself was stalling, hoping he would leave. He didn't. Instead, he stepped outside, pulled his phone, and made one more call. "Activate secondary protocol," he told the voice on the line, "and tracker devices. If anything's missing, I want it flagged." There was a pause. "Do we escalate?" the voice asked. Jeremiah looked back toward the building, then down at the cracked sidewalk. "Not yet, but we're getting close." Somewhere between fury and focus, he remembered the last message Leona had left him 3 days earlier. Just a short voice note about their father's medication, and something about the house needing a new porch light. She had laughed in the end, a soft, tired laugh he hadn't realized he'd memorized until now. That laugh kept replaying in his head like static under the silence, pushing him forward as the sky finally cleared. Because whatever had happened in that gas station parking lot, Jeremiah Carter wasn't just here to ask questions. He had come to tear the silence apart. By sunrise, the story had already begun its quiet descent into the machinery of control, slipping into email threads and whispered hallway instructions where truth was less important than preserving the image of order. Inside the Westbridge Police Department, Chief Dennis Holt stood at the edge of his office window, sipping burnt coffee from a chipped department mug, watching the light creep across the parking lot like a slow interrogation. His mind wasn't on the shooting anymore, not exactly, but on the headlines that might follow if the wrong people found out what the victim had in her wallet. A civil rights attorney was bad enough. A sister to a Marine Corps officer with top-level Pentagon clearance. That was the kind of fire that couldn't be smothered with a carefully worded press release. He turned back to his desk, where a manila folder lay open filled with surveillance stills, initial officer reports, and a copy of Leona Carter's identification cards which he had ordered, scanned, printed, and locked away in the department safe. He had dealt with use-of-force incidents before, had overseen cleanups, had rewritten timelines and reworded affidavits. But this one had a different weight to it, and for the first time in a long while he felt the uncomfortable prick of exposure, not because he feared being caught, but because this time the stakes weren't entirely local. In the hallway outside, Sergeant Boyd was already leaning on the doorframe waiting for instructions. "Press is sniffing around," he said. "Local radios asking for the body cam footage." Holt didn't look up. "They'll get what we give them, which is nothing. Not yet." Boyd nodded, understanding the unwritten rules as well as anyone. "You want me to talk to the witnesses?" he asked. Holt finally glanced over, eyes sharp. "Talk to them. Make sure they know the weight of accusing a cop. Remind them it's a felony to lie on a statement." There was no threat in his voice, just policy. Down the street, Rosa Peña sat alone at her kitchen table, cradling a cup of tea she hadn't touched, staring at the small notepad where she had tried and failed to write down what she'd seen. The memory was clear, but putting it into words made her hands shake, not from fear but from the understanding that telling the truth might not be enough to protect someone or herself. Her phone had already rung once that morning, a blocked number, no voice on the line. Just breathing, just silence. She didn't call back. Back at the station, Officer Travis Kincaid was doing what they always told you to do after a shooting: say as little as possible and say it the same way every time. He sat in the briefing room with Officer Langley, the department's internal affairs liaison, who wasn't taking notes but was watching carefully. "Tell me again," Langley said. Kincaid rubbed the bridge of his nose, his voice low. "She didn't stop. I told her to. She reached fast, looked like a weapon." Langley didn't nod. He just watched, waiting for the pauses, the stumbles, the tells. Later that morning, a short internal memo was sent to the town's mayor and select members of the city council, assuring them the situation was under control. The phrasing was exact, designed to calm without informing. "The subject is in stable condition." The officer acted in accordance with protocol pending further review. No mention of the bystanders. No mention of the victim's identity beyond a vague reference to her as a female subject. But Chief Holt knew this couldn't be buried the usual way, not with a name like Carter and not with federal eyes potentially watching. So he picked up the phone and made a call to Martin Glenn, editor of the local Westbridge Chronicle, a man with a gambling habit and a long history of favoring department narratives when things got messy. "We've got a situation," Holt said, voice casual. "Don't want this thing turning into a circus. You'll be getting a statement soon. Print it as is." Glenn didn't argue. He never did. But even as he hung up, he wondered why his palms felt sweaty. Across town, a patrol car cruised slowly past Rosa Peña's house, headlights off, moving just fast enough to not raise suspicion. A second one followed 20 minutes later, parked down the street for a while, then drove off without knocking. She watched them from the window, her fingers wrapped around the curtain like it was the only thing keeping her from unraveling. She didn't call anyone. She just stayed quiet. At the hospital, Jeremiah Carter had finally managed to speak with the night nurse, who told him the room was restricted and visitor access was being handled by the police. "She's still unconscious," the nurse added gently. "But she's fighting. You can see it in the way she breathes." Jeremiah nodded, thanked her, and didn't say what he was thinking, that sometimes the fight didn't start when you were shot. Sometimes it started when they tried to erase the evidence that it happened at all. Back in the department, a small team had gathered in the basement evidence room reviewing items collected at the scene. A technician named Doyle opened the bag containing Leona's purse and froze when he realized something was missing. "Her phone's not here," he said aloud. "It was in the photos, but it's not in the bag." The others exchanged glances. One shrugged. Probably logged somewhere else. But no one went to check. And inside Chief Holt's locked office, that very phone now sat in his desk drawer, powered down and wrapped in a gray cloth. He hadn't turned it on. He didn't need to. He knew what that device meant, and more importantly, what it might contain. He stared at it for a long time, then slid it deeper into the drawer and locked it again. By noon, the first article appeared online, echoing the department's talking points. "Late-night altercation ends in officer-involved shooting," the headline read. "Suspect under investigation for possible erratic behavior." There was no mention of her credentials, no mention of the witnesses, and no photos, except for a blurry aerial shot of the gas station under police tape. But the silence didn't feel settled. It felt stretched. And somewhere beneath the weight of every word unsaid, every file misplaced, every call unanswered, something began to bend. Because the truth, however, buried has a way of shifting the ground beneath the people who try to keep it hidden. And in Westbridge, the ground was already beginning to move. The hallways of Westbridge Regional Hospital had that familiar scent of antiseptic and artificial air, the kind of cold sterility meant to project order, but never comfort, like a place built to heal, but not necessarily to care. Jeremiah Carter walked them slowly, deliberately, his boots quiet on the waxed linoleum as he passed identical doors with faded numbers and plastic nameplates. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, flickering every so often, in a way that made shadows blink on the walls, and each turn in the corridor felt like a test of patience and composure. He had been here before, in other hospitals, in other parts of the world, watching over wounded men whose uniforms matched his. But this was different. This was personal. This was his sister. He reached the nurses' station for the intensive care wing, and paused, scanning the faces until one of them looked up. Her name tag read J. McAllister, and her eyes widened slightly when she saw the badge he quietly set on the counter, though she didn't ask questions right away. "I'm here for Leona Carter," he said calmly. "I was told she's in this wing." The nurse hesitated, flicked her eyes to a clipboard, then back to him. "Room 412, but she's under police restriction. We're not supposed to allow visitors without clearance from the department." Jeremiah leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to just above a whisper, not out of secrecy but out of something older, something like sorrow made heavy with restraint. "She's my sister," he said, "and I outrank everyone who told you not to let me in." The nurse held his gaze for a moment longer, then glanced over her shoulder and gave the faintest nod toward the end of the hall. "Keep it short," she said. "They're making rounds again soon." He walked the final stretch slower than before, his hand tightening unconsciously around the folder he carried, knuckles pale against the leather. When he reached the room, the door was slightly ajar, and he pushed it open with the same cautious instinct that had saved him more than once overseas. The light inside was dim, the blinds half drawn against the midday sun, casting long bands of shadow across the white sheets and the still figure beneath them. Leona looked smaller than he remembered, fragile in a way that was hard to reconcile with the woman who once stood in courtrooms and refused to flinch when judges raised their voices or officers tried to talk over her. Her hair was pulled back, tangled at the edges, and a web of medical lines stretched from her arms to machines that hummed in rhythm beside her. The monitor above her head blinked steadily, recording the fragile certainty of life one beat at a time. He stepped closer and stood silently at her bedside, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest beneath the thin blanket. There were bandages across her left shoulder and upper chest, stained faintly at the edges. A breathing tube had been removed recently, but her throat still bore the red imprint of where it had rested. Jeremiah didn't reach for her hand. He didn't speak. He just stood there for several long minutes, eyes tracing every detail, every wound, every evidence of someone else's violence made real against the person he had spent his life protecting. Then he looked around the room and saw what wasn't there. Her phone, her purse, her coat, the leather-bound legal pad she always carried with her. All of it gone. The standard hospital issue bag sat at the foot of the bed, almost empty, one pair of shoes, a sweatshirt, and a paper form listing personal items removed by request of law enforcement. His jaw tensed, and for a moment the mask of quiet professionalism cracked. He stepped out of the room just as a uniformed officer rounded the corner. The man stiffened slightly at the sight of him, but said nothing. Jeremiah didn't break stride. "Who gave the order to block her visitors?" he asked. The officer blinked. "You'll have to talk to the chief." Jeremiah nodded once. "I intend to." At the front desk, he requested the full medical intake report, knowing full well it would be redacted. As expected, the attending nurse hesitated. "It's under police review," she said. "I'm not authorized to. You don't have to be," he interrupted, gently sliding a folded document across the desk. "This is a federal order. The patient is considered a national security asset. I need everything you have." The file was handed over 10 minutes later, trembling slightly in the nurse's grip. Jeremiah flipped through it without sitting. Gunshot wounds to the upper torso, 2 exits, 1 lodged near the clavicle. Emergency surgery within 40 minutes of arrival. Blood loss critical but stabilized. No toxins in her system, no signs of narcotics. Clean slate. But what chilled him more than the injuries was a short notation scribbled in the margin of the intake sheet. "Arrived with DOD credential, removed by PD before admittance. No explanation logged." He stared at that line for a long moment, then quietly folded the file and tucked it under his arm. Walking out of the ICU, he didn't head straight to his car. Instead, he paused outside the hospital, standing under the faded overhang of the emergency entrance, letting the wind pass through his coat and across his chest like a second heartbeat. The town around him still moved slowly, like nothing had happened. A mail truck rolled by. A woman walked her dog. A man in uniform sipped coffee beside his cruiser. But Jeremiah Carter knew better. This was the kind of quiet that came before the rupture, the kind of calm that some people mistook for control. And as he stood there, staring across the parking lot to where his sister had been shot just a few hours earlier, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. They had tried to erase her. They had tried to seal the room, control the story, strip away her name, and replace it with a label. But they had underestimated the one person who would never accept that silence. And they had no idea what was coming. Rosa Peña sat at her kitchen table with the blinds half-closed, hands wrapped tightly around a chipped ceramic mug she hadn't touched in over an hour. Her knuckles pale and motionless, as if she were holding more than just lukewarm tea. Perhaps the weight of what she saw, or the cost of what she might say. Outside, the wind moved gently through the maple trees, lining her street-rustling leaves against the side of her house, like hesitant footsteps, while a police cruiser parked 2 houses down idled with its lights off and windows up. The silhouette of the officer inside barely visible through the tinted glass. She didn't look directly at it anymore. She had already done that once 2 nights ago, and the officer had met her gaze with the kind of stare that wasn't meant to intimidate but to warn. The kind that made you feel foolish for believing that the truth alone could keep you safe. She had started writing down what happened the night Leona Carter was shot, what she'd seen from across the street as she picked up a dropped grocery bag, and she'd gotten as far as, "The woman didn't shout, didn't run, didn't threaten before." Her pen stopped and wouldn't move again. Now the notepad sat at the edge of the table like a challenge she wasn't sure she could face, while her phone vibrated for the 3rd time that morning. Caller ID, reading private number, just like it had the day before. Meanwhile, 2 blocks away, Detective Erin Banks sat in the back corner of the department's records room, her eyes fixed on a login screen she'd been told not to access, fingers hovering over the keyboard like a diver at the edge of a dark pool. She had joined the Westbridge Police Department with a clean badge, and the kind of optimism that hadn't yet been chipped away by shortcuts, silence, or sideways glances. But something about this case, about how fast the narrative was being stitched together and how carefully the rough edges were being filed down, had unsettled something in her that wouldn't go quiet. She knew what she was doing wasn't just against protocol, it was dangerous. But the footage was still stored on the internal server, marked as pending deletion rather than erased, and she wasn't going to pretend she didn't know how to access it. When the folder opened and the thumbnail preview flickered to life, her heart thudded hard once, then settled into a slow, steady rhythm. There it was, grainy but unmistakable footage from the pharmacy's exterior camera, captured just before the department had swept in and claimed the tapes were corrupted. Erin clicked. Download, then slipped a flash drive from her pocket hand steady, even as her pulse surged. What she saw wasn't dramatic in the cinematic sense. No shouting, no struggle, no sudden chaos. Just Leona, stepping forward, calm, deliberate, reaching into her coat pocket, as Officer Kincaid raised his voice and his weapon in the same breath. No verbal warning, no command to stop. Just movement, fear, and 3 flashes of muzzle fire that lit up the edge of the parking lot. The footage ended with Leona on the pavement, motionless as her purse spilled across the asphalt and the camera timecode flickered to black. Erin leaned back in her chair, breath catching like a thread pulling tight across her chest. She knew without a doubt that the official report was a lie. By late afternoon, Rosa finally returned one of the calls, not to the police but to a number she'd written down quietly after overhearing 2 men talking at the pharmacy. One had whispered the name Jeremiah Carter, and the other had said he wasn't local but the kind of man that makes other men nervous. She wasn't sure what to expect when she called, but when the voice answered calm and clipped, she simply said, "I saw what they did to your sister." There was a pause long enough that she nearly hung up. Then came a quiet response. "Tell me everything you remember. From the beginning." That same evening, Detective Banks walked out of the precinct with her badge still clipped to her belt and the flash drive tucked into the inner lining of her coat. She didn't feel brave. She felt like a candle someone might blow out without hesitation. But she also felt something else, something closer to clarity, a recognition that sometimes doing the right thing wasn't about heroism, but about refusing to be complicit by default. She didn't go home. She went straight to the address. Rosa had texted her, a small tan bungalow with a front porch light that flickered weakly in the wind. Inside, Rosa answered the door without hesitation, her shoulders tense but her eyes resolute, as if something fragile had finally locked into place inside her. Erin introduced herself with only her first name, and they sat across from each other in the kitchen, the notepad now filled with careful handwriting and the flash drive placed gently between them like a shared secret. "If you're sure," Erin said softly, "this won't be easy." Rosa nodded once. "Nothing about watching someone get shot in front of you is easy. But not speaking, that would kill me slower." As the sun sank behind the houses of Westbridge, 2 women sat in quiet resolve, not as saviors or whistleblowers or even allies at first, but as people who had both seen something they could no longer unsee, and who had both reached a point where silence had become heavier than risk. In that moment, without ceremony, the cover-up began to fracture. And far across town, in a sterile room filled with blinking monitors and the slow hiss of oxygen, Leona Carter lay still, unaware that the first strands of truth were finally threading their way out of the shadows she had been left in. What she didn't yet know but would come to understand is that sometimes justice doesn't start with noise, but with the quiet decision of someone who chooses to speak when they're told to stay silent. And in this town, those voices were finally beginning to rise. The sun had just begun to rise over the government buildings in Washington, D.C., when the secured conference line in the Department of Defense lit up with a silent urgency, its pale green glow washing across the polished surface of General Whitaker's desk like a quiet summons. He had been briefed at 4:15 a.m., not by staff, but by a personal message marked with a red protocol tag reserved only for domestic security breaches involving sensitive personnel. The name Leona Carter meant little to him at first, until the attached files displayed her clearance level, her encrypted communications history, and most concerning of all, the fact that she had activated her emergency code less than 30 seconds before being shot by a municipal officer in a town not yet on any federal watch list. The general didn't ask questions. He gave orders. A single call was made to the Department of Justice, where a federal liaison with deep ties to military intelligence picked up the thread without hesitation. And by the time most of the town of Westbridge was waking up to the sound of sprinklers and early traffic, a quiet black SUV had already crossed the county line, driven by a man who wore no uniform but carried a badge that outranked everyone in the state by 3 bureaucratic layers. His name was Special Agent Marcus Keene, and for most of his career he had worked in counterintelligence, where you learn to read silence faster than words. Keene didn't announce himself when he arrived at the police department. He simply walked through the front door, showed credentials that weren't meant for public inspection, and asked to speak to the chief. The desk sergeant blinked, glanced at the silver-edged badge, and said nothing. "I'll see if he's available," the officer mumbled, picking up the phone with the kind of hesitation that said everything Keene needed to know. 2 minutes later, Chief Holt appeared in the hallway wearing a practiced smile and a shirt that hadn't been pressed. "Agent Keene, is it? Didn't know this was federal jurisdiction." The chief's voice was calm, but his eyes flickered once the way a man's do when he realizes the rules might be shifting. Keene didn't sit down. He didn't even ask for coffee. "We're conducting an internal assessment regarding the shooting of Leona Carter," he said, every word clipped, and even, "We'd like to review your department's incident logs, body cam footage, and all witness statements taken since the event." The chief offered a tight chuckle, gesturing toward the glass-walled conference room. "Of course, we're always happy to cooperate with federal partners. Transparency's a priority here." But even as the words left his mouth, he was already calculating what files could be delayed, what footage could be reported as lost, and which officers would need reminders about what had or hadn't been seen. Meanwhile, in the records room, Detective Erin Banks stood behind a filing cabinet, heart pounding as she slid a manila envelope into her coat. Inside were 2 witness statements that contradicted the official timeline, a photocopy of the missing security footage, and a typed memo that showed a deletion request issued before the investigation had even begun. She didn't plan to leak them. Not yet. But she wanted them close, just in case someone higher up finally asked the question she'd been warned not to answer. Across town, Rosa Peña found herself staring out the window again, her tea growing cold as she watched another police cruiser roll by slower than traffic laws required. She'd given her testimony the night before to a woman from the DOJ who had shown up without a local escort, wearing plain clothes but asking precise questions. Rosa had told her everything, the posture of the officer, the way Leona moved the moment the gun fired before a word was spoken. "We'll protect you," the woman had said gently, "but you may need to be brave for a while." At the hospital, Jeremiah Carter watched from the hallway as a team of military personnel arrived in civilian clothing, slipping quietly into the restricted wing, where Leona remained sedated but stable. They brought with them a biometric scanner, a locked briefcase, and a technician who asked to examine the hospital's server logs. Their purpose wasn't medical, it was forensic. They weren't just protecting Leona. They were recovering whatever traces of communication had been left behind before her phone went missing. Inside her room, the machines beeped steadily, a metronome for a body still at war with itself. Her left hand twitched once, a sign of returning awareness, and the nurse adjusted her IV with the careful gentleness of someone who understood that healing came in quiet increments. Jeremiah stood at the doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight. He hadn't spoken much in the past 24 hours, not because he had nothing to say, but because everything he felt came sharper in silence. Back at the station, Agent Keene requested a digital copy of the body cam logs, and when the IT officer tried to stall, citing system maintenance, Keene opened a laptop and initiated a live data extraction. "I don't need your permission," he said without malice. "I only need access." Within minutes, corrupted files were recovered, their timestamps matching the exact window of the shooting. One file showed an officer's boot stepping backward just after the gunfire. Another picked up ambient audio from a patrol car, 3 loud pops, no verbal commands preceding them. The evidence wasn't complete, but it was enough to raise flags, enough to break the illusion of internal control. By late afternoon, a sealed directive was delivered to the local courthouse, authorizing a federal review of the department's investigative process. No announcement was made, no press release followed. But every officer in the building felt the shift, the sense that the walls were no longer only watching outward but inward too. Officer Kincaid, still on administrative leave, sat at home watching reruns of a show he couldn't follow, the volume too loud, his phone turned face down on the coffee table. When the doorbell rang, he didn't move right away. When it rang again, he turned off the television and stood slowly, his palms sweating against his jeans. That evening, Agent Keene walked the perimeter of the gas station where the shooting had taken place, noting security camera angles, cross-checking timestamps, speaking briefly with the pharmacist who had called 911 and now refused to be quoted publicly. "People are scared," she said quietly. "They've made it clear what happens when we speak up." Keene didn't promise her safety. He promised a record. "If they come for you," he said, "we make it public. All of it." And as the sky turned dark over Westbridge for the first time in days, the silence no longer felt one-sided. It felt like a curtain about to be pulled back. Something was moving. And for those who had orchestrated the cover-up, that movement felt less like justice and more like reckoning. The first thing Leona Carter heard wasn't a voice or a machine, but the faint rhythmic beeping of her own heartbeat echoing through a haze of stillness, like a signal trying to find its way back through heavy static. Light seeped in slowly from the corners of her vision, pale and indistinct, and the sensation of her body returned in fragments, pain first sharp and radiating from her chest like broken glass beneath the skin, followed by the dry, paper-thin texture of her mouth, and the weight of her limbs, as if gravity had doubled in her absence. She didn't try to move. She simply existed in that strange border between consciousness and confusion, her mind grasping at the last memory it could hold on to. She remembered the cold parking lot, the sound of shoes on asphalt, the voice that didn't ask but demanded. She remembered the flashlight in her eyes, the careful motion of her hand reaching for ID, and then the shots, 3 of them fast and final, followed by the searing heat of collapse and the taste of blood at the back of her throat. But beyond that, it was darkness. Not death, but a holding space where nothing moved and nothing grew until now. When she opened her eyes fully, the ceiling above her was white and dimpled with acoustic tile, like every hospital ceiling she had ever seen during her civil rights cases, except this time she was the one in the bed. Her breathing came in shallow draws, accompanied by a faint hiss from the oxygen line near her nose. There were machines all around her, humming, blinking, and whispering their coded messages to a nearby nurse's station just beyond the door. She didn't know how long she had been unconscious, but something in her body told her days. She turned her head slowly and found Jeremiah sitting in a vinyl chair beside her bed, arms crossed, posture straight, despite the fatigue etched into his features. His eyes were fixed on her before she could even speak, and when she met his gaze, something flickered across his face, a mix of relief, fury, and protective grief that only someone who had held back tears for too long would recognize. "You're awake," he said softly, leaning forward. "Leona, can you hear me?" She nodded, just barely, and tried to speak, but the sound came out raw and broken. He stood quickly, reached for the water cup on the tray, and brought the straw to her lips. She sipped slowly, each swallow sharp and unfamiliar. Then, after a long pause, she rasped, "How bad is it?" Jeremiah didn't answer right away. Instead, he exhaled through his nose and sat down again. "They're circling the wagons," he said, "but it's starting to come apart." Leona closed her eyes, not in pain but in recognition of the weight that statement carried. She had seen it before in courtrooms and city council hearings, in depositions that were edited and complaints that were buried. She had fought this machine her entire adult life, but she had never been the one trapped under its wheels. Did they say why?" she asked, eyes still closed. "Why he shot me?" Jeremiah leaned forward again, voice low. "They said you moved too fast, that he thought you were reaching for something dangerous." Leona let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't ended in a cough. "I told him I was getting my ID. I told him exactly what I was doing." She opened her eyes, and for the first time, the focus in them returned sharp and full of purpose. And he still pulled the trigger. Jeremiah didn't flinch. "We have witnesses, we have footage, and we're recovering what they tried to destroy." Leona's brow furrowed slightly. "Footage? I thought they said the cameras were out." Jeremiah allowed the smallest smile to touch the corner of his mouth. "They didn't know about your app." For a moment she looked confused, then something clicked. Her eyes widened slightly. "The automatic upload," he nodded. "You said it was standard for people with your clearance, that if law enforcement engaged, the phone would record and transmit." Her breathing caught again, but this time not from pain, from memory. "I said my name, I said my position, and then I reached." Her hand twitched at her side, fingers curling reflexively around an invisible wallet. "That's all I did." Jeremiah placed a hand gently on her arm. The audio file made it, and the Pentagon's forensics team pulled the original security footage from the pharmacy's backup server. The footage matches your story perfectly. Leona stared at the ceiling again, processing the implications, her mind already working through the legal strategies, the next moves, the pressure points. "They'll fight," she said quietly. "They always fight harder when they know they've already lost." Jeremiah nodded. "They already started. Local news is pushing stories about your activism in college. Chief Holt is trying to close the investigation before we get a subpoena, but we've got federal agents embedded now. And your name is the one thing they can't erase this time." For a moment the room was silent again, save for the pulse monitor keeping time. Then Leona turned her head slowly toward the window, where sunlight was beginning to stretch across the blinds in thin golden lines. "Tell them I'm ready to talk," she said softly. "I want a recorder in here tomorrow. I'll give them everything." Jeremiah looked at her, and something in his posture shifted, not as a soldier but as a brother. "You sure?" she nodded. "They tried to silence me, but I'm still here, and I remember every second." Outside, the hospital reporters had begun to gather beyond the barricades. Protesters too, holding signs, chanting quietly, their voices not yet loud but growing. Somewhere nearby, a police scanner crackled with tension, and inside the Westbridge station, Chief Holt paced behind closed doors, watching the threads of his containment plan unravel one by one. But in room 412, Leona Carter Street, ill-broken still, healing was already becoming something else. Not a victim, not a case, but the center of a storm that was no longer just about her. And as she closed her eyes again, not to rest, but to think, she knew the next time she spoke, the world would have no choice but to listen. It began without ceremony in a windowless federal office lit by buzzing fluorescents and the hum of computers that never fully powered down, where cardboard file boxes were stacked like quiet indictments, and the air smelled faintly of toner and tired resolve. Special Agent Marcus Keene sat at the head of a narrow metal table, reviewing the final set of documentation before placing a thick folder at its center, the front stamped with the name Leona Carter and a sequence of federal case numbers that stretched across 2 agencies. Around him sat 3 attorneys from the Department of Justice, a military liaison from the Pentagon, and a digital forensic analyst who hadn't slept in 23 hours, but still nodded as Keene spoke. "We now have physical surveillance footage, authenticated witness statements, and a full audio file capturing the moment Officer Kincaid engaged without warning," Keene said calmly. "That's enough to formally initiate grand jury proceedings under federal civil rights statutes. We'll move within 48 hours." The room remained silent for a beat too long, as if the weight of what was coming needed a breath of its own before momentum took over. Across the country, in the Westbridge Police Department, the atmosphere had changed in ways that were subtle but deeply felt. Officers who once greeted each other with casual confidence now moved more cautiously, their conversations quieter, their computer screens locked faster when someone entered the room. The break room coffee sat untouched, and the usual gallows humor had disappeared, entirely replaced by sidelong glances and the unspoken understanding that someone, maybe several someones, was talking to the feds. Detective Erin Banks knew the feeling well. She had turned in her sealed packet of internal memos and unauthorized footage the day before, sliding it across a secure table at a temporary federal field office set up 5 miles outside town. No one had congratulated her. No one had promised she'd be protected. But the agent who took the evidence met her eyes and said, "You did the right thing." And in that moment, that was enough. She hadn't gone back to the department since. She wasn't sure she ever would. Rosa Pena, too, had followed through. She had sat with investigators for nearly 3 hours, detailing every detail she could remember. From that night, the posture of Officer Kincaid, the speed at which Leona reached into her coat, the sound of gunfire that came before any instruction was given. They had listened, asked careful questions, and then shown her a freeze frame from the pharmacy's exterior camera. "Is this the moment?" the agent asked. Rosa leaned in, eyes welling slightly. "That's exactly it," she whispered. "That's when she was still alive." Back in room 412, Leona Carter had asked for a laptop, not for entertainment but for testimony. Her voice was still thin, but her mind had returned with full clarity, and she spent 4 straight hours recording a formal affidavit from her hospital bed, recounting frame by frame what happened in the minutes before the shooting, and what she remembered from the seconds afterward. She included the name the officer called her. She described the expression on his face, and when asked how she felt in that moment, she said, "I knew he didn't see a woman. He saw a target." Jeremiah sat nearby throughout, saying nothing, his presence a steady anchor in the room. He watched his sister tell her story, not with drama or embellishment, but with the kind of practiced discipline that came from years in courtrooms, years spent arguing for justice on behalf of others. Now it was her name in the headlines, her body in the bed, and her voice shaping the record. That same night, the grand jury convened in a secure building under sealed orders. Testimony was presented without delay: footage, audio ballistic analysis, medical records, and sworn statements from both civilian witnesses and one unnamed officer who had broken rank and described the manipulation of internal reports as routine. The jurors, most of them retirees and professionals from surrounding counties, listened intently, shifting in their chairs as the weight of evidence accumulated hour by hour. They heard about the deletion request for the dashcam files time-stamped just 90 minutes after the shooting. They saw the side-by-side comparison of the original footage and the doctored version presented to the press. And when the forensic analyst played back the audio of Leona's calm voice, identifying herself as a federal legal consultant just seconds before the shots, they sat in stunned silence. No warning, no hesitation, just gunfire. The next morning, the indictments were signed. Officer Travis Kincaid was charged with civil rights violations under color of law, use of excessive force, and obstruction of justice. Chief Dennis Holt was charged with conspiracy to interfere with a federal investigation, evidence tampering, and multiple counts of intimidation of witnesses. 2 other officers, one from the IT division and one from Internal Affairs, were also named for falsifying digital records and pressuring staff into silence. When the news broke, the town of Westbridge didn't erupt, but it shifted. There were no riots, no broken windows, just a deep exhale from a community that had been holding its breath for far too long. Parents talked to their children about the word accountability. Teachers changed their lesson plans. A quiet memorial appeared near the gas station where the shooting occurred. Flowers, candles, a photo of Leona smiling in her law school graduation robe, and a handmade sign that read, "We see you. We hear you. We won't look away again." And through it all, Leona stayed quiet, her body still healing, her voice reserved only for what mattered most. The fight wasn't over. The system hadn't changed. But for the first time in a long time, the truth wasn't buried. It had been spoken, documented, and believed. And in that there was a beginning. Not of closure, but of consequence. The morning after the indictments were announced, the town of Westbridge woke under a sky that felt heavier than usual, as if the clouds themselves were waiting for permission to exhale. The courthouse stood silent for a moment longer than it should have, its steps empty before sunrise, but within an hour the plaza was filled with a crowd that didn't roar or chant. It just watched, quiet and wide-eyed, as the blue curtain began to peel back. Local news vans lined the block, reporters speaking into microphones, with forced calm trying to sound impartial, while the gravity of what they were covering sank deeper with every word. Inside, in a secured chamber away from the public gallery, Leona Carter arrived in a wheelchair, wearing a dark blazer that covered the healing scars beneath, but not the fatigue in her eyes. Her posture was straight, her expression neutral, but there was a quiet intensity to the way she scanned the room, as if memorizing every face, every detail, knowing she would be asked to relive this moment again and again, in words, interviews, headlines, and court transcripts. Jeremiah walked beside her in silence, offering nothing more than a hand on her shoulder before stepping aside, letting her face what came next on her own terms. As she gave her formal statement to the presiding judge, her voice never cracked, though the room seemed to hold its breath at every sentence. She spoke plainly without dramatics, describing not only the night she was shot, but the history of encounters, the patterns she had studied, the systems that enabled those moments to happen again and again. "I wasn't shot because I was dangerous," she said, pausing briefly. "I was shot because someone believed I didn't belong. and the system they worked in gave them permission to pull the trigger before asking the question. The judge listened without interruption, but his hands fidgeted with a pen, as if the weight of her words unsettled something he couldn't quite name. When she finished, the silence in the chamber wasn't awkward, it was reverent, like the closing lines of a prayer. No one clapped, no one moved. But something fundamental had shifted in the room, and everyone knew it. Outside, Chief Dennis Holt was escorted into custody by 2 federal agents, wearing the same suit he had worn during press conferences, now slightly wrinkled and a shade too thin for the cold wind rolling in from the north. He didn't resist, he didn't speak. But the flash of cameras captured his face in profile, a face no longer in control, no longer protected by layers of bureaucracy or silence. As he was led down the steps, a small group of protesters parted to let him through, their signs held high but their voices held back, choosing stillness over spectacle. Officer Travis Kincaid was arrested quietly at his home 2 hours later. He had already packed a bag, and when the officers knocked, he opened the door without waiting for them to speak. "I figured it was today," he said flatly, handing over his ID and badge with a kind of resignation that was neither apology nor defiance. In his living room, the television played old news footage of the protest that had formed outside the hospital weeks earlier. He didn't look at it. He didn't say a word during transport. And when asked if he understood the charges against him, he simply nodded, once eyes downcast. Meanwhile, the town itself began to fracture socially, politically, emotionally. Church bulletin boards posted prayers for healing and unity, while coffee shops buzzed with conversations that no longer danced around the word racism. Families who had lived side by side for decades now eyed one another with unease. City council members called emergency meetings to address community concerns, though many were more concerned with their re-election campaigns than reconciliation. The police union released a carefully worded statement denouncing the weaponization of federal oversight and the targeting of dedicated officers, but public trust had already begun to rot from the inside. In private homes, survivors of police violence watched the news and wondered whether this was a turning point or just a pause. Some of them began to speak up, joining community forums, contacting attorneys, revisiting old case files buried under dust and trauma. One man brought out a box he had kept in his attic for 4 years. Photos, affidavits, letters his son had written before he was killed during a traffic stop, ruled accidental discharge at the time. "Maybe now," he said to his wife, "someone will finally listen." Leona, for her part, remained out of the spotlight after her testimony. She declined interview requests, ignored news alerts, and focused instead on breathing through the pain, both the kind stitched into her muscles and the kind that wrapped around her thoughts like a persistent ache. She worked with a physical therapist each morning, pushing her body inch by inch toward recovery, and in the afternoons, she began outlining a legal proposal for a statewide civilian oversight commission, scribbling notes with her non-dominant hand, because her right arm still trembled when she wrote too long. Jeremiah stayed in town longer than planned. He attended every court hearing, sat in the back row, and watched as attorneys parsed the truth into admissible fragments. He wasn't a man given to public displays of outrage, but when reporters asked why the Pentagon was involved, he didn't hold back. "Because this isn't just a local matter," he said. "When injustice becomes systematic, it's a national security concern. And when the law is bent by those meant to uphold it, that's not just misconduct, it's treason against the trust of the people." The statement went viral. And though Jeremiah hadn't meant to become a figure in the story, he found himself drawn into it nonetheless, invited to panels, summoned to closed-door meetings, asked for his opinion on reforms he had once believed were too idealistic to implement. He said yes to some, no to others. But always he reminded people where the center of the story really lived. "She's the one who lived it," he told a Senate aide. "Don't put me on the podium. Put her name in the law." By the end of that week, the Justice Department formally announced its intention to investigate patterns of misconduct in Westbridge and surrounding counties, citing a documented culture of retaliation and procedural neglect. They stopped short of calling it corruption. But to anyone paying attention, the subtext was clear: this wasn't an isolated case. This was a blueprint. And as the first round of federal subpoenas went out, reaching deeper into departments, court clerks, and city contracts, a different kind of silence settled over Westbridge. Not the silence of intimidation or suppression, but the kind that comes just before a house long rotting from the foundation begins to collapse under its own weight. A silence full of cracks. A silence ready to break. And Leona Carter, still healing, still steady, was no longer the subject of that silence. She was its undoing. The early spring air still held a bite to it, but the sky above Westbridge was unusually clear. The morning Leona Carter stepped outside for the first time without assistance, her right arm still braced in a soft sling, her gait cautious but determined as she walked the length of the hospital's front path. Her therapist had said she wasn't ready, and the nurses had advised another few days of rest, but Leona had decided otherwise. It wasn't about recovery anymore, it was about movement. About proving to herself more than anyone that she could still occupy space in the world without flinching, that she could walk back into the same world that tried to erase her and plant herself in it like she had never left. A small group of community leaders stood by the curb, waiting to greet her, some holding clipboards, others holding back tears. They had invited her weeks ago to speak at a town hall event focused on police reform and community healing, but Leona had declined the spotlight. What she offered instead was something quieter, and in her view, far more lasting: a legal framework for local civilian review boards, with subpoena power, independent budgets, and public accountability reports. She named the proposal Justice Bridge, not because she liked metaphors, but because she understood the truth. Real justice isn't a destination, it's the structure that helps people cross from silence to voice. That afternoon, in a repurposed library basement on the east side of town, Leona met with organizers from 3 surrounding counties. They didn't wear suits or speak in legislative jargon. They wore hoodies and denim jackets, carried old laptops in canvas bags, and brought with them stories that sounded like echoes of her own sons pulled over for no reason, brothers lost to traffic, stops families paid off with settlements that came with silence clauses. She didn't speak much at first. She listened, nodding slowly, her eyes calm but sharp. And when they finished, she said only this: if they thought this ended with my case, they misunderstood who they were dealing with. Word of Justice Bridge spread quickly, not through headlines or press releases, but through community centers and church meetings, whispered phone calls and late-night planning sessions where people sat at folding tables, editing bylaws, and drafting action plans by the light of flickering fluorescents. And Leona, still healing, became a quiet constant in the background, reviewing policy language from her bed, making calls between rehab sessions, showing up unannounced to city council hearings, not to speak but to take notes. She worked closely with Rosa Peña, who had since taken a leave of absence from her part-time teaching job, to coordinate witness outreach and public education. Rosa, once hesitant to say her name out loud, now stood behind podiums and told her story with a voice that no longer trembled. They counted on our silence, she told a packed crowd at a community event, but we gave them the one thing they couldn't control: our memory. Detective Aaron Banks, who had resigned from the Westbridge Police Department a month earlier, joined Justice Bridge as a policy advisor focusing on officer accountability and training audits. She refused media interviews and declined offers from national organizations, choosing instead to drive between rural townships with a trunk full of folders and a mission to rebuild something better from the inside. When someone asked her once why she didn't just leave the state, she answered without hesitation: because if we all leave, the people who stay won't stand a chance. Meanwhile, Jeremiah Carter returned to D.C., where he resumed his position at the Pentagon, but kept a close watch on the DOJ's expanding investigation into regional policing practices. He met regularly with Leona via encrypted calls, sharing updates on national oversight conversations and providing logistical support when Justice Bridge encountered legal resistance. But more than that, he served as her grounding force, reminding her to rest, to eat, to step back when the weight of the work threatened to pull her under. One morning, as he watched her from the audience at a regional town hall in a neighboring city, he saw something shift in the room. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. The way people looked at her had changed, not as a victim of a broken system, but as someone who was helping define what its repair might actually look like. Afterward, as the crowd began to thin, he approached her quietly, slipping a thermos of ginger tea into her hand. "You did well," he said, his voice low. She looked up and smiled, tired but whole. "It's not about doing well," she replied. "It's about staying in the room when it would be easier to walk away." And so she stayed. Through court delays and media backlash, through cynical op-eds and partisan debates, through sleepless nights and the ache that never quite left her shoulder. She stayed not because she had something to prove, but because she understood something deeper than victory. She understood continuity, that justice is not loud, it is patient. It builds not in the shouts of protests alone, but in the steady rhythm of policy, presence, and persistence. By spring, 4 cities had passed versions of the Justice Bridge model. 2 more had proposals under review, and in Westbridge, the City Council approved a resolution to rename the old community center on Monroe Street the Leona Carter Civic Forum. She didn't attend the ribbon cutting. Instead, she sent a short letter read aloud by Rosa. "This is not a monument to what happened to me. It's a reminder that the people who survive injustice often become the architects of the world that rises after." The applause was quiet, reverent, and sustained. The applause was quiet, reverent, and sustained. And somewhere in the back of that crowd, a young man recorded the moment on his phone, not for likes or views, but to send to his mother, who once told him after he'd been stopped and frisked on the way home from school, "One day, someone's going to make them listen." And someone had. It was a mild afternoon, somewhere between spring and summer, when Leona Carter stood in the shadow of a building that now bore her name, the lettering freshly mounted on the stone in clean, brushed metal, the Leona Carter Civic Forum. The air was filled with the kind of quiet anticipation that only comes after long, painful battles. Battles fought not just in courtrooms and hearings, but in hospital beds, living rooms, and late-night policy meetings held around coffee-stained tables. The ceremony wasn't grand. There were no streamers, no television cameras, no politicians looking to anchor their careers in someone else's pain. It was just community neighbors, friends, volunteers, and families who had seen something terrible and chosen day after day to do something meaningful in response. Leona stood with her cane planted firmly beside her, her weight still not fully restored to the left leg, and a gentle wind brushing against the hem of her navy blue coat. Her right arm, once nearly paralyzed, now hung more naturally at her side, still stiff, still recovering, but present like the rest of her. She didn't say much that day, didn't read a prepared speech, or offer a soundbite for social media. She simply looked at the small group gathered before her, her eyes moving slowly over each face, and said, "Thank you for not letting this be the end of the story." Behind her, children ran across the trimmed lawn, their voices rising with the kind of joyful noise that hadn't been heard there in years. One boy wore a t-shirt printed with the words, "Ask me about Justice Bridge," and a teenage girl stood beside him, handing out flyers, detailing a new initiative for youth police dialogues led by local high school students. Inside the building, in what used to be a neglected auditorium, the lights were being tested for an evening panel discussion on truth and reconciliation, where both former officers and community organizers would sit side by side, not to debate, but to listen. Jeremiah watched all of it unfold from a bench near the garden wall, his arms folded loosely across his chest, his expression thoughtful and proud, though his eyes occasionally flicked toward Leona, watching for signs of strain. He had always known her. Strength had trusted it even when she doubted it herself. But seeing her here, not just walking but building, not just surviving but leading, felt like watching someone return from war with their integrity intact. And in a way, that's exactly what it was. Rosa Peña, now affectionately known in town as Miss Rosa, walked beside Leona as the ceremony ended, her cane clicking rhythmically on the sidewalk. "You remember what I told you in the hospital?" she asked, her voice warm but steady. Leona turned to her, smiling softly. "You told me this would take more than justice. You said it would take memory." Rosa nodded. "And you've given them both." Inside the Civic Forum's main conference room, a wall had been dedicated to those who had spoken up during the grand jury investigation, witnesses, whistleblowers, and community members who chose truth over safety. Their names were printed in neat rows, not elevated or heroized, but preserved. A glass case held a copy of the flash drive Detective Aaron Banks had used to deliver the first round of digital evidence, along with a handwritten note she had sent after relocating to the neighboring county. "Change doesn't always begin with bravery," it read. "Sometimes it begins with discomfort that you finally refuse to ignore." In the months that followed the trial, Westbridge had begun to look different, not in the way that television shows portray reform, but in the quieter, messier ways that real progress tends to appear. The police department was restructured under civilian oversight, with new policies for use-of-force reporting and mandatory de-escalation training conducted by independent agencies. Recruitment practices were revised, prioritizing not just experience but cultural accountability. And for the first time in the town's history, public complaints could be filed anonymously without being redirected through the same channels that once buried them. Still, not everyone embraced the changes. Yard signs reading "Protect Our Officers" appeared on some lawns, and a local newspaper ran a series of editorials questioning whether outside influence had overstepped its role. But for every whisper of resentment, there was a louder conversation happening at kitchen tables, classrooms, and council chambers, a conversation that had finally become impossible to ignore. Leona didn't return to the courtroom. She didn't resume her civil litigation practice or seek appointment to any state advisory committee. Instead, she devoted her time to building systems that outlived her presence. Justicebridge expanded beyond policy reform to include legal education, workshops, digital rights training, and crisis response support for other communities experiencing similar incidents. In one quiet moment when asked why she hadn't taken a larger platform, she responded simply, "Because leadership isn't about being visible, it's about making sure others can see a way forward." One afternoon, nearly a year to the day since the shooting, a high school student named Malik approached her after a community Q&A session. He held out a notebook with slightly trembling hands and asked, "Would you sign this? I want to be a lawyer one day." She smiled, took the pen he offered, and wrote something more than just her name. Beneath it she added, "Be the voice that makes silence impossible." And that perhaps was the legacy. No one could measure the shift in how people saw themselves, how they saw their power, their right to be heard. The change didn't sweep in like a storm. It crept in like sunrise, slow, patient, persistent. And in every space that had once gone dark with complicity, a light was beginning to stay on just a little longer each night. Back at the Civic Forum, as evening settled in and the building filled with footsteps and conversation, Leona stood quietly near the entrance, watching as young volunteers set up chairs and adjusted microphones. She didn't interrupt. She didn't instruct. She just watched the way a gardener watches something bloom, knowing her hands were in the soil, even if no one saw them now. The scars beneath her clothing still ached on colder mornings. The trauma didn't vanish, didn't dissolve in the shadow of achievement. But it no longer defined her, it informed her, and that made all the difference. As the doors opened for the night's discussion, the last rays of sunlight slanted across the lobby floor, catching the edge of a metal plaque near the entrance. It read, "This building stands not because someone demanded justice, but because someone refused to stop until others could demand it too." And for the first time in a long time, Leona Carter smiled, not for the cameras, not for the crowd, but for herself, because the work wasn't finished, but it was finally truly underway. What this story reminds us, especially those of us who've lived long enough to see justice denied more times than we can count, is that silence doesn't protect us, and truth, no matter how delayed, is worth fighting for. Leona Carter didn't set out to be a symbol. She didn't ask for the pain or the scars. But she chose to rise anyway, to speak when it was easier to stay quiet, and to turn personal tragedy into public purpose. And through her resilience, we learn that real change isn't about one grand moment. It's about small, steady choices made every day by people who refuse to look away. For those of us watching from our homes, especially those who've seen how slow justice can move, let this be a reminder it's never too late to speak up, to support someone brave enough to stand, or to demand better from the systems meant to serve us. Whether you've marched in the streets or simply raised a question in your own community, your voice matters more than ever.